group, the interest of the group going before the individual interest. Ghana is very much a collectivistic culture. Masculinity versus femininity speaks about, as a nation, feminine trait. Ghana, at 40 as a score out of 100, is considered feminine. And what that means is, in general, okay, these are trends. It's not individual characteristic, but national trends. In general, that means that there's an inclination for cooperation, modesty, caring, collaboration, and so forth. This one was interesting. Uncertainty avoidance speaks to the fact that at 65 over 100, Ghanaians usually prefer they prefer to avoid uncertainty. So they like to have concrete things happening. They don't like to step in the uncertain realm of things. Long-term versus short-term orientation, Ghana is definitely short-term, which means they value tradition, and the nation as a whole looks at the present and past rather than the future. And then indulgence versus restraint talks about Ghana at 72 is more restraint nation, and that means they like to enjoy life, and that is so true. It's so fun to be out there. All right, next. And I'll go through those pretty quickly, Maria. So this was a qualitative study with a phenomenological approach. Next, there were 3 research questions. What are the experiences of women? What challenges and benefit did they encounter? And then what support did they receive to gain access to their position of leadership in schools, but also to navigate those patriarchal and traditional cultures. Next. So 12 schools, 12 women leaders. Next. I conducted in-depth interview, were in the school a few days in each school. And so that was the bulk of my data collection. Next. And then, of course, I did what everybody does, coded the data and came to themes. And that's what we're going to see next. But before that, to ensure the trustworthiness of the data, which is next slide, I took the following precautions. So let's look at the finding, Maria. You remember that power distant, it's accepting hierarchy, accepting, you know, that power is distributed inequally. And so women spoke to me about, and I have direct quote here, they spoke about, well, it's not easy to be a female head teacher. Over there, it's principal, because the male teachers, the chief of the village and the coaches are not respected. So they would come to me and say, you know, when I first started as a principal, the village chief would come and would say, well, what is this little woman can do in a big school like this of 500 kids? They would hear those comments pretty frequently, and they were not necessarily welcome. But they had that desire, that strength, that inner motivation to help the community and their schools. And they would say things like, I want to let the men know that we can lead. No matter what I have a positions, so I can decide to do something or not. And this woman decided to do a whole lot. And in Ghana, you put O at the end of a sentence when you emphasize things. So they would speak about, it's difficult, oh, or there's a lot of intimidation there, oh, meaning it's not an easy journey to reach that leadership position and to keep it. All right, next. So that was power distance. In terms of collectivism, Ghana, very collectivistic. So to navigate the particular patriarchal culture and more traditional culture in some ways, they got together. The women across different schools and different districts in that region would get together through networks. And that took several several forms. There could be a WhatsApp group, and they would chat, they would visit, jump on their motorcycle and visit each other's schools and vent and talk about how they navigated, you know, parents teacher meetings when the dad says this or that or the other to the principal. They also had networks through the Ghanaian Education Service and different associations. And then when I asked them, okay, so how do you navigate also the fact that you're a working professional in a traditional culture, and you have a family, a lot of them did have families, that work-life balance. And again, they use that collectivistic trend and attribute to help them out so they could go to school. And some of these women traveled an hour and a half each way in very difficult roads and conditions to just get to the school. And so family members would help, neighbors, they would create their own network so that life at home could go on as well at school. Next. So in terms of femininity, that's what Ghana is considered. And so, you know, attributes such as caring, collaboration. And they spoke to me about traditionally, in their views, a lot of these women were teachers before being principals, and they had worked for male principals. And so they saw the male leadership style and had experienced it as more top-down, deciding what to do for others. And for them, they really had different leadership styles. They talk about being servant leaders. They didn't have to take the spotlight. Instead, they were rather trying to put other people on the spotlight. They talk about adapting their leadership style to whatever the circumstances were and were needed. They could be very much autocratic if a teacher was late and that was impacting the kids' education. But then they would be very understanding when a teacher was sick or was on maternity leave or was having to go home because of their child, because they themselves had birthed children. So they understood that. And that leads me to the next point. They all talk about motherly love and understanding that they went through labor, they went through all this. And so they can really connect with families and community members that are also women. They can connect to the girls in their school and model for them so that they don't get pregnant too early, but rather stay in school and finish their education, which in some rural areas of Ghana, it's contradictory to the culture. The girls are often married early and go to different homes, or they help at home because sometimes they have to walk very long ways to just fetch water. And so they saw their roles as role model for those girls, educating them that they don't have to miss school if it's their time of the month, and providing all that kind of support. They also talked about being sensitive to cultural differences. And so you had principals that lived in urban areas working very long ways in rural areas, and being able to adapt to that culture by listening, observing, going in the community, and understanding that people have very different lives in the rural and urban areas. And so adapting their leadership style, adapting really how they interacted and dealt with community members. Next. In terms of uncertainty, these women were in, I think they, these women were really successful in terms of they did gain respect of chiefs and community members and parents. It took them time to navigate those cultures, understand, get support, but they were very successful. And in fact, they in the end, receive a whole lot of support from those community members that would not at the beginning. But they talked about being very uncertain themselves, almost having like the imposter syndrome, where they never felt really completely appropriate. In fact, they never applied to be principal themselves. All of them were nominated by a former principal, by a colleague, by someone from the Ghanaian educational system. And so, you know, once they were nominated and motivated by someone else, they're like, okay, well, then I'm gonna do it, I can do it. And they sought that support I talked about before. But they were really uncertain themselves at first, sort of giving into that patriarchal culture, but then going beyond. All right, next. And then this one, short-term orientation culture in Ghana, that means they value traditions. And those women, that was interesting because although they navigated the traditional culture, they really valued it as well. The belief system in general, and, you know, so there's a witchcraft in Ghana that they call juju, and some woman had been the victim of juju, and she was telling that story and how so respectfully she navigated what someone was trying to do with her, but with the utmost respect as well for that. Okay, in that area, that's what people believe. So how am I going to respond is my choice, is what she kept telling me. Like, that's my choice to respond, but I cannot impose my view to that community. So next, please. So I think this study was significant and it's been published already, but on many different levels. One is, the question is not whether we should support female education leaders, but really how. How can we support them from just the fact that they may not nominate themselves to be a principal? They may need the help of someone. So what can we do at the higher education level to make sure they have what they need, so that they have the tools and the motivation, but also the self-confidence to apply for those positions? Because we do need more female leaders, because they do change nations, because they can relate more to girls. And in these countries, girls are not always in schools. Next. So there's limitation, like any study. It was one district in Ghana in public schools, which limit the transferability to other school contexts. So my plan is, of course, to keep going with that line of inquiry. And next, couple recommendation I gave to local university there. Leadership training is needed for all leaders in Ghana. Leadership training in West Africa is not a given. So that is needed. But I also heard from the woman that it would be helpful to have additional training for them, particularly around just this, how to navigate the patriarchal culture and traditional culture. And they said maybe one idea would be to have gender training, just women, just like affinity groups, where they can debrief and vent and among women and support each other. Same way, an association could be created just for women, given what they often have to go through to attain leadership roles, but also to keep it. Affirmative action programs, and of course, in terms of research, always more is needed, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, comparative studies as well. And I believe that's all. So with that, I'll say a big merci and thank you, Maria, for attending to the slides here for me.
Thank you so much, John. Let me see. So we don't have any questions in the chat at the moment. I'm wondering if anyone in the audience would have a question for Dr. Brion that we could ask right now. Let me see. Okay, any questions? Well, actually, I have a question if I could ask something. So from all these cultural attributes that you have discovered or you have acknowledged that exist in Africa, especially in West Africa, I was wondering, because we know that the pandemic has hit Africa not as hard as other parts of the world. They have been, for the most part, spared. And we also know that the most recent, the Omicron variant, was discovered in South Africa, mainly because of the testing that they do that is so much more thorough than they did even in the Netherlands. That was really where that strain was first started. So what I was wondering is, do you think that the culture in Africa has been in some way a reason for Africa's relative success in managing the pandemic?
Okay, so can you please repeat the question? I was distracted by a question in the chat, sorry.
So the question was, do you think that culture in Africa has been in any way a reason for the relative success of Africa as a continent in weathering the pandemic more successfully than other parts of the world?
Well, I can't answer that because Africa is very, very big. And so I'm speaking about Ghana, you know, and a particular 12 women in a particular district within particular tribes. And so I'm reluctant to speak to that. It's also noted that when I was there, it was just the beginning of the pandemic, early 2020. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't been able to go back since.
Okay, well, Julius, so I think that we're gonna try to leave the questions for the end of the presentation. So the other question from Anna Marie, I think we're just gonna wait to ask until the end. In that case, let's move on to our next presenter. Let me first share her bio. So our next presenter is Dr. Satang Nabani, and she is the Director of Programs at the University of Dayton Human Rights Center. She is both a legal scholar, a practitioner, and social justice advocate. Her work focuses on international law, human rights law, and monitoring mechanisms, human rights in Africa, gender equality and women's rights, democratization in Africa, comparative constitutionalism. So a lot of institutions. She has worked with academic institutions, human rights bodies, governments, and non-government entities on law and policymaking, advocacy, and institutional reforms. And she's going to speak to us today about creating global awareness about human rights issues in the United States and around the world. So with that, please take the floor, Satang, and welcome.
Sure. Thank you very much, Maria, for moderating this session, as well as thank you, Julius, for bringing us together for the Global Voices Symposium and on the theme of Africa in our century. And I believe it's a timely theme. Yes, I know I'm biased. And I think that's sort of also on a very personal note, I guess, I also come into this conversation as somebody that was born and raised in Africa, in one of the smallest countries in mainland Africa. And in most cases, I come from the Gambia. In most cases, when I am describing to people where the Gambia is, I usually have to say it's inside Senegal. But also considering myself a global citizen where, I lived and learned and got educated in quite a lot of the African countries. I also live in the US and work in the US. And so I come from that sort of, varied position as well. And also, I guess I sort of also, as Maria said, wear two hats, one both as a legal scholar, but also as a human rights practitioner and activist who have been involved in human rights advocacy at the grassroots virtually my whole life. And that sort of led me into academia. So I really come from a specific position, especially committed in terms of ensuring bringing in the other voices, people that are usually not the ones that are usually brought at the table to talk, but also, in terms of advocating for the marginalized groups and others as well. I tweaked my presentation a little bit, less of a presentation and more of a, I guess, a potpourri of issues on resetting global awareness, which is the theme of our session, but also guided by human rights. The director of programs at the Human Rights Center, which is a center here that really, I guess, brings into reality UD's commitment to human rights, peace, and security. And so we do quite a lot of work around conducting research-driven participatory advocacy, also educating future practitioners, especially with the human rights studies, as well as just fostering inclusive and reflective dialogue and learning, especially between the North and the South. So in terms of my presentation, well, less of a presentation and more of a conversation, I guess, is that I wanted to look at how we can sort of reset global awareness given the COVID pandemic, guided by human rights. So that means that I am doing less of a focus on a specific human rights issue and more of what the challenges are, especially given the COVID pandemic, but also the path ahead and what we can do as a global community, as UD institution, but also in terms of collaborating with others across global divides and across the world as well. Thanks. Next, Maria.
Oops.
Oh,
that one said, sorry.
No worries. No, and I mean, especially in relation to human rights in the world, I mean, I guess I just started with this reflection from the preamble of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which talks about the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, which is the foundation of freedom, justice, justice and peace in the world. And I think this is an important thing to reflect on, especially given what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening in several other countries that are currently going through crisis, which in turn usually is a human rights crisis in the end. Next. Oh, yeah, my quotes seem to have disappeared, but that is Eleanor Roosevelt, and it was really about the importance of human rights for all. And, it's a quote that I can share later on. I mean, it's a quote that doesn't seem to want to be seen, so it's fine. We can skip it, Maria, thanks. Okay, so let's talk about the COVID pandemic a little bit. I'm talking about the COVID pandemic, especially within the context of human rights, as I said. I think one thing that really comes out, obviously, we know that the COVID pandemic with the health issues that came through, people losing their lives and all the negative consequences that it came with, we also recognize it's sort of also, I think there has always been a recognition that we live in a globalized world. But the COVID pandemic also was a sort of like a wake-up call to, sort of remind us that, there is global interconnectedness in relation to, how we live, where we travel to, and all of those sort of things. And I think in a way, and very much connected to the last point on the slide about the unprecedented social movements that we've also seen as well, was this idea that, during the COVID pandemic, we also saw the rise of non-violent civil resistance movements and also social movements, especially in 2020. We saw that in Sudan with the democracy protests that happened. We saw that in Belarus as well, very much reflective of popular demand for democracy. In India, we saw the India farmers protest, which was like the biggest demonstration in the history of the world about farmers' rights. In Chile, we are seeing, the push for constitution making and rewriting a constitution and involving ordinary people. But we've also seen, especially the Black Lives Movement, which have existed in the US for quite a long time. But we've also noticed that, especially in 2020, as well as with the unfortunate incident of the murder of George Floyd, it sort of also had global implications where we saw protests in countries around the world. So I'm saying this just to show that whilst we have always acknowledged that there was global connection between us, the COVID pandemic also did show this as well. And I think one thing, especially in relation to the second point about the full spectrum of human rights, I think in a sense, what we've also seen, and we've always been, especially those that are in the human rights ecosystem, has always talked about the, the interdependence of rights, right? That one right is dependent on the realization of the full rights of others, right? And especially, especially given the COVID pandemic, talking about the right to health, we know that, the right to health is not a standalone right as well, that it's also very much dependent on other things, other rights, and sort of there really shows the full sort of the full spectrum of rights, whether it's civil and political rights, whether it's economic and social rights, as well as rights that deal with development issues as well. I think in a sense as well, why the COVID pandemic was a wake-up call, I think we've also sort of seen the trend where we've also seen the weakening of human rights, right? Obviously, with the pandemic happening and public health crisis happening, there was, in most cases, justifiable right to limit certain rights, like freedom of movement. So there were lockdowns in several places, right? But we also did notice that that generally, especially in places where there was democratic repression, for instance, and regression and human rights regression, given the fact that the limitations on right in most cases were not justifiable in a way, and we're not following the rules and standards, international rules and standards that limitation of rights were meant to be as well. I know, Maria, you raised the issue about COVID and African culture. I'm not going to attempt to answer that, but what we've also seen, especially, is around vaccine nationalism and inequities with regard to vaccine development, which has really sort of mirrored, right, that inequalities that has marked the rest of the pandemic. So really showing the divide between Africa and the rest of the world, the global South, developing countries, and such marked differences among us as well. And I already spoke about the social movements as well, so we can go to the next one. In a way as well, and I also wanted to, as I said, I'm really talking about human rights within the context of COVID. So really what we've seen, especially in terms of the present challenges, and these are also not challenges that are just present, I guess some of them are continued challenges and their implications as well. I think, very much connected to Corinne's insights, and very, very great insights, especially in terms of what is happening in parts of Ghana, but which also, as she highlighted, is particularly limited given the fact that it happened before the COVID pandemic, but also acknowledging that due to the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's the closure of schools, whether it's the curfews that we've seen, the lockdowns, economic limitations in terms of especially most of the global population that are living in poverty as well. We've seen the marked inequality, especially that is experienced by women and girls. And if we're talking about African women and girls, we've seen very much, and there is evidence, for instance, to show that, we know that women are more than half of the population of the world, and they continue to be subjected to different forms of discrimination, as well as exclusion and disempowerment. Gender-based violence, we know that during COVID, especially domestic violence against women and girls has been on the increase, but we've also seen worldwide, especially in the African continent as well, that there is increase in child and forced marriages, for instance, and these are things that the COVID pandemic has further exacerbated, because there is evidence, and UNFPA as well as other UN institutions have very much highlighted how, for instance, there is quite a lot of setback in relation to some of the sustainable development goals that we have, especially in relation to goal 5. In a sense as well, I think, and this is also very much connected to the social movements, that the persistence of racism, patriarchy, and neo-colonial power structures in the US and globally continues to happen, right? I think, obviously with what happened with George Floyd, but also what is happening in quite a lot of the global South, I guess, and I use global South in quote, given my apprehension about the term, but using it for this particular context, but obviously with some of the things that are also coming out, especially with regard to the Eurocentric and biasness towards some of the reporting that is currently happening with the Ukraine crisis. I mean, there is need definitely to utilize frameworks that helps us to understand, especially the negative impact of coloniality. We know that colonialism has ended, but obviously there is continued negative impact of coloniality, as well as racism and oppressive structures that are really even embedded within the human rights architecture that some of us utilize as well. And we know that in most cases as well, it is that Black people, the indigenous communities, as well as other groups, are really usually the ones that are racially discriminated in the US, but also those that are discriminated against as well in the global South. And obviously, I spoke a little bit about this, but obviously we know that with some of the current challenges that we have, obviously there is increasing authoritarianism and repression around the world, whether it has to do with, there is evidence to show and data is out there to show that there is decline in democratic global landscape, as well as setback in terms of development progress, as I said, but also even within democratically elected governments in our various countries, we've also seen increased repression, especially within the COVID-19 pandemic. But also to say that, and this is me now wearing my African hat, to say that this is not just an African problem. I mean, the events that we've seen on January 6th is a good indication of how some of these democratic backsliding can even happen in countries that are quote unquote developed countries. And so I think in a sense as well, and I think that's also very much connected to the team, is not that seeing that, or connecting Africa with most of the negative things that we usually connect Africa to. Yes, I agree, we have our own challenges, we have our problems, but also in certain cases, especially with regard to the rise of fake news, with regard to the rise of anti-rights alliances, very much within the context of the US, very much rooted in white supremacy culture, that this is something that we need to talk about, and it's a challenge, and it has huge implications for human rights for all as well. Next, Maria. And just I know that I don't have a lot of time, just to highlight also these key critical challenges as well, including the global impact of climate change. Obviously, I think we will all agree that climate change is perhaps the biggest threat to our survival as a species, but also that we also have seen of the evidence of this, especially in relation to its impact on human rights and the realization of human rights generally as well. And that we're engaged in climate action, but I think part of it must also be rooted very much in human rights-based approaches, which is underlined by participation, by equity, as well as other principles as well. And obviously, given the COVID pandemic, there has been sort of, not just the COVID pandemic, but we've seen a rise in corporate power, but also very much connected in terms of the use of new technologies as well, especially with regard to surveillance technologies that poses and continue to pose risk to privacy as well as human rights issues. Next, Maria. Okay, so all of those things are like the bad things. They are just challenges, right? I mean, I guess we live in a world where there is continuous challenges. And I think part of this conversation today, as I said, I took a little bit of time because I really wasn't sure whether I should deal with a specific human rights issue or talk about the various challenges that we face as people that live in a globalized world, I guess. In a sense, I think these are things that activists on the ground are using, practitioners are using, everyday people are using, and I just wanted to highlight it, but also in terms of just bringing in other perspectives as well. I think one is with regard to the innovative use of international legal avenues to document abuse, including racism as well, right? So we know that, for instance, you have the UN, you have all the treaty monitoring bodies like the Human Rights Council, you have the CEDAW committee, you have all of those things. When you go to the regional level, for instance, you have the African Commission on Human Rights with all our human rights treaties. The European Human Rights Commission also has one. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission or system also has sort of the human rights treaties as well as the mechanisms to oversee the implementation of these rights. So what I'm saying is that we have international legal avenues, whether at the UN level or regionally, depending on where you live, in terms of supporting everyday activists to document abuse, but also to provide testimony as well as to sort of exert political pressure on our governments which has really been a useful tool, not just only for activists, but also for racial justice activists as well. In December of 2021, the Human Rights Center, for instance, hosted the social practice of human rights, where we had the opportunity to hear, for instance, about some of the examples within the US context where, racial justice activists utilize the international human rights mechanisms, such as the Human Rights Council, which, for instance, saw testimony or had the brother of George Floyd appearing before them. So all I'm saying is, and part of this conversation also is to demystify the international legal avenues. They're not just for quote unquote expats. They're for people, everyday people that are really the ones that are, sort of the ones responsible for human rights coming to life. So in a sense as well, these international legal avenues are there, and definitely there are avenues for, activists as well as people from around the world to utilize it, whether at the UN level or regionally as well. I shared Crenshaw. Crenshaw is very well known for her conceptualization around intersectionality, and she talks about if you see inequality as a dumb problem or unfortunate or the problem, that is a problem itself. And in a sense, it just builds on this idea around fostering and building intersectional solidarity, which is important. I guess in a sense, we don't live siloed lives, that what is a problem here, for instance, what is happening in the Ukraine affects people in the US, affects people in Africa, affects people around other countries and regions around the world. And in a sense as well, it's really how do we come together to support each other, transnational solidarity that doesn't just focus on me dealing with women's rights issues or they dealing with indigenous rights issues, but cross-cultural solidarity as well. Maria, I know I'm supposed to be done soon. I'll be done soon. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. I think this particular space, given the fact that the University of Dayton is the one hosting this global symposium, symposium, I think it's also important as well to talk about, the role of universities in promoting human rights and human rights education, especially for their students. Obviously, we know that UD has a unique institutional commitment to human rights. And as I said, definitely the Human Rights Center, as well as the Human Rights Studies, is really curated for bringing that to life. But I think in a sense as well, it's not just for the institutions that are given the mandate to do human rights work. In a sense, I think it is all of our responsibilities as people that are part and parcel of the university, but also, I know that, for instance, Sinclair is here and other universities and other people around the world are part of this conversation. And so in terms of how do we think around utilizing universities as a space to promote human rights, but also to ensure that we're able to push and articulate and utilize, a framework of human rights education that is useful for students. I think the COVID-19 pandemic really, for instance, shows the need for a resetting or a revisioning of human rights education itself that is very much rooted on anti-racist as well as decoloniality, which is important, especially given the context that we live in as well. But I think in a sense as well, I know that UD is very much known for its push for experiential learning, which is a key component of human rights education. For instance, at the Human Rights Center, we do this, especially in terms of not just providing human rights foundation for students, but also in addition to experiential learning opportunities. I know that in the previous student session, there were conversations around that. But for instance, we have the Moral Courage Project, we have the Malawi Practicum, in which the students go to Malawi to do research, but we also have the anti-trafficking work that we do through Abolition Ohio and others as well. I think in a nutshell, I think it's, especially when I talk, there is obviously a lot of conversation around decolonizing human rights education. I'm not going to start that conversation here because I think that's a whole conversation by itself. But I think in a sense, it's about in higher education institutions, engaging in critical self-reflection about their own roles in the continued, sort of legacy of colonialism, as well as racist policies, as well as in terms of reimagining how human rights education and teaching needs to look like in the 21st century, and especially given the COVID pandemic. And very much connected to that as well is just bridging the divide between academia and activism. I think in a sense, I think that's important because, as I said, usually when you talk about human rights, it's seen to sort of be in the hands of experts. And this is why, for instance, with the Human Rights Center, we're very much focused on the social practice of human rights, which is really recognizing that it is the everyday people that sort of bring through their lived experiences, through their behaviors, as well as through their actions, sort of bring the reality of human rights to life. So in a sense as well, it's not just thinking that human rights needs to, lawyers are the ones that know what is happening with human rights, or it is professional advocates or academics, but rather that it is the people that are actually doing the work on the ground that we should learn from, in a sense. So really thinking around how we bridge the divide between academia and activism, and really learn on the practices of what is happening on the ground to bring to the classrooms to sort of build and develop the next generations of practitioners as well. And I think I'm almost to the last slide, right, Maria? Yes. To the last slide. I think, just quickly in relation to this, it's just, as I said, just acknowledging that the human rights architecture itself, has its own problems. It's in sort of a way needs to that, whether as educators, as global citizens, as activists, that we need to be actively anti-racist, I guess, anti-colonial, as well as anti-oppressive, in order to ensure that we try to rebalance and redistribute power. I know that's a mouthful, that's a whole lofty goal, but it's something that we should ultimately aim to do in relation to that. And lastly, just in terms of ensuring that digital technology is a force for good, as I said, obviously there is concerns around privacy as well as digital rights, but also acknowledging that, we could use the new technologies that we have for the common good, for investigating human rights. And so, for instance, we have been, the Human Rights Center has been collaborating with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, as well as the University of Dayton's Department of Geology, to use GIS, that is geographical information systems, especially in terms of providing students the opportunity to use these applications, for instance, to investigate human rights violations. Recently, we had one in which we were looking at human rights violations in Myanmar, as well as other projects. And the idea is in terms of how do we ensure that students, especially given that we're in higher education institutions, that students are given the opportunity to be engaged in advocacy that is important in the real world, right? Successful advocacy that can be done in the real world, as well as just pushing this whole premise around that there is power in regard to experiential learning as a tool in education, especially for human rights education in that particular sense. And lastly, I just wanted to re-echo the UN Secretary General's comments when he, and I quote, "With the pandemic shining a spotlight on human rights, recovery gives us an opportunity to generate momentum for transformation. Now is the time to reset, to reshape, to rebuild, to recover better, guided by human rights and human dignity for all." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Satan. So after going through this broad view of human rights and what's happened during the pandemic, we're gonna do the questions later. We're gonna have Joanne Mawasha, who is our next speaker. And she is going to talk to us on a more regional, local level. So talking about the pandemic, but how does that affect our city and our community of Dayton, Ohio? So let me give you some background about Joanne. Joanne Wright Mawasha. She is the Deputy Director at the City of Dayton Human Rights Council. In this capacity, she helps to lead the city's anti-discrimination endeavors to ensure that Dayton residents receive fair and equal housing and their civil rights are guaranteed. She believes that communities must be created so that they are empowered to lead and enact changes in their lived environments. Joanne continually strives to ensure that the voices at the table are diverse and inclusive, and believes that social justice, equity, and understanding of all people are essential to fair and flourishing communities. She finds most rewarding serving others and opportunities to affect positive change in marginalized communities. Joanne received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Wright State University's School of Professional Psychology. While she does not actively practice, she uses her skill set in building relationships through convening multiple organizations in her ongoing pursuit to expand our understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a native of Nassau, the Bahamas, and enjoys life with her family. She says her best time are meeting new people, fellowshipping with great food, libations, conversation, and laughter, which I'm really looking forward to doing with you. So, Joanne, please take the floor. You don't have any visuals, so it's just your wonderful face. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Maria, for a great introduction. Dr. Amin, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been a part of this process for a few years now, so I'm always amazed at just the knowledge and the depth of knowledge that I'm always presented with. So thank you so much for allowing me to come back again and have this opportunity. So, you know, my two colleagues spoke about more on a global scale. I'll bring it down to a more local level in terms of Dayton and what we saw during the pandemic and continue to see. So as Maria said, I'm the Deputy Director for the Dayton Human Relations Council. And so most of you who may not know about the HRC, it's the Human Relations Council. And the HRC was created in 1962 to protect and enforce the civil rights of our residents through, you know, fair housing, around discrimination, employment, public accommodations, and credit card transactions. We also were created to ensure that a percentage of every contract awarded by the city is allocated to women, minority, or small business enterprises. And that is to enable that, you know, equity is shared. And that you know, dollars are being pushed into the community to Black and brown businesses as well. We also committed to ensuring that the relationship between the community and the police remains civil and open. We've done a lot of work with the police and communities around you know, police reform, as you may have heard about recently in news. And finally, we welcome immigrants and refugees from all over the world through our outreach efforts to new Americans in the Dayton area. We attempt to integrate these the new Americans and new immigrants into the receiving community through intercultural exchanges in employment, education, culture and arts, and government and justice. You know, while that, you know, and recently we had our Welcome Dayton program that we had, our initiative, it was internal, it's been moved to another department. We still work with them closely to ensure that we are providing trusted and reliable information. So today I've been asked to talk about, you know, the impact of the pandemic in Dayton. And so while this is not exhaustive, you know, I think it captures well what we witnessed and recorded in our work at HRC. So one of the things, you know, I think we heard about it was the eviction. You know, evictions were up in the community because, you know, people just weren't, they were laid off, they couldn't go to work. We had the safe distancing, CDC guidelines. So locally, we saw many persons who weren't able to pay their housing costs, their apartment costs. So the federal government, through the CARES Act, they sent down monies to all communities. And so monies were allocated to the Dayton and Montgomery County region to really disperse monies to persons to help them so they can have housing. So an eviction moratorium was in place, and during that time, persons could not be evicted from their homes as a result of them not being able to pay their bills. And then also to the monies that came down from the federal government, we were able to ensure that those monies got to the community who needed it. So even though there was an eviction moratorium, landlords were still wanting to evict persons. So Dayton, the city of Dayton, adopted the stay in place, pay to stay ordinance, and that meant that no one could be evicted if they were going to be having their bills paid or their housing bills paid. So that gave them a small stay to not be evicted from their home or their abodes during the height of the pandemic. That has since ended. So now you have persons who are the eviction courts really are seeing, a large amount of persons facing eviction as a result of them not being able to pay their bills or back pay, because there's a backlog, very much so, in terms of just them accessing the funds. The funds are there, but they have a hard time accessing it. So organizations such as Community Action Partnership and Montgomery County, they have been allocated dollars to help local residents pay their rent, with back rent, whatever have you. But there is a backlog as a result of that. Landlords became impatient because they weren't getting paid, and then you have persons who needed to pay their landlords and they didn't have the money. So you have this kind of catch-22 where monies were there, but they weren't being allocated quickly enough. And then, so when the moratorium ended, you had landlords now, putting their tenants in eviction court to have those have them be evicted. Some landlords were okay with waiting, others were not, because they weren't getting their rents paid. So they made a decision to either allow persons to stay in their homes or had them leave. We also saw very, very early on, and I know many of you may have experienced this, not at your level, but we saw how the digital divide really, really impacted marginalized communities who are already marginalized. So early on in the pandemic, you had libraries being closed. There was no cafes to go to. So people really struggled to connect to the internet. They had no access to computers to connect to the internet. So school districts, for instance, like Oakwood, who were really, high tech, they had these the resources. Many students in marginalized communities did not have those resources to even connect to communities. So falling further behind, the educational gap as well too. So I think one of the things we quickly saw was that the pandemic just exacerbated already existing problems in marginalized communities. And that, I think, was the takeaway that we got in terms of how do you now, one, identify the gaps, and two, how do you shore up the gaps so that it doesn't happen again, or we can work towards finding solutions to ensure that we uplift communities and really provide more resources in the event that something like this happened again. We also saw an economic downturn for women-owned, minority-owned, and small business enterprises. Many of them had to close their doors. Many of them were small owners, mom and pop stores, and many of them were unable to pay their bills, unable to pay employees, so they had to close shop. Fortunately, the federal government provided some funds Paycheck Protection Plan, and they were able to shore up some funds. But the reality is that many of these businesses will never open again because they don't have the capacity right now to reopen. And so you have, communities who are already just struggling and already marginalized regarding, Black and brown businesses. They're falling even further behind. Another economic downturn as well. Another thing we saw was, the language access. So, it may surprise many of us that, much of the information that was coming out in our community, they were not translated. So you had refugees and immigrants, new Americans who did not speak the language, not being able to access information on a timely basis. What we did at the HRC, we assisted public health as well as Montgomery County and CAP in really translating those materials, making sure our residents got fair and accurate information about where to apply for assistance, what to do in the pandemic to remain safe. So we saw all of these kinds of issues, again, really impacting marginalized communities. And the digital divide, as well as the language access, proved to be a huge issue and continues, I think, to be an ongoing struggle we have. How do you ensure that persons who lack access or language access to English and English languages in their resources in their own language have access to those translated materials? And that still remains a barrier for many in our community. And like I said before, we saw an educational impact on students that were already challenged with learning disorders, and in kinds of in communities or in schools that were already challenged by resources and staff as well as funding. So we had students who weren't going to schools, they were at home. Parents, because they spoke a different language, were not able to help them with their schooling. So falling even further behind, and then also to getting reliable information on where to get help, that also proved to be a challenge. And, you know, I think Satang mentioned the fact that, you know, there was an increase in you know, calls for domestic violence. Well, you know, nationally here in the US, we saw that there was a decrease in domestic violence calls because, you know, women who probably were home with their abusers weren't able to call, use the phone to call and reach out for help. So definitely we saw a downturn or a downtick in, you know, calls for help in terms of, you know, domestic violence in homes. And, you know, lastly, just wanted to talk about just, you know, from my seat where I, you know, from where I sit in terms of, you know, the acknowledging the importance of mental health and how that continues to, it seemed to, you know, it's always been a part of our nomenclature, it's always been a part of our lives, but I think that pandemic really highlighted how important it is to seek help. And I know that many people in Black and Brown communities do not seek help regarding health or mental health services. So really ensuring that, one, the resources are there, that people feel comfortable and confident asking for help when they need help and not wanting to just solve the problem on their own. I think one thing I found in the work that we do here is that, like I said, I think we saw marginalized communities even become more marginalized, if that's even a phrase, but we saw them really hit hardest in terms of, you know, the housing issue, you know, the digital divide, economic downturn really is going to be a challenge in terms of getting back to some level of economic stability. We saw language access issues with our new Americans, so persons who did not speak the language and having reliable information being translated for them. We saw, again, the impact on our students in terms of them falling further behind in marginalized communities. And then really, just like I said, acknowledging the importance of mental health. You know, we at the HRC are practitioners, so we have tried to collaborate with other organizations who are in the same ecosystem. And one of the things we did, we got together a group of over 70 organizations through some funding we got from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And we convened a group every month to find, you know, just to share information around housing, around these very challenges, because we knew that, you know, when you're in this, I think sometimes, like, I think Satang mentioned it, you know, you in this siloed bubble where everyone is doing their own thing. But I think that the pandemic has forced us to really try and find ways that we could, one, collaborate, ways that we can pool our resources, and also ways in which we can really, you know, really acknowledge honestly what's going on in our community around racism, around classism, around just all these inequities that we see in our work. And so really bringing this group together on an ongoing basis, and we continue to see it on an ongoing basis to find out what are challenges, solutions, the gaps that we can do to ensure that Dayton remains, in my opinion, warm, welcoming, and inviting for all who live, work, and gather here. So I thank you for listening to me, and I know I didn't have any slides, but hopefully that took something from that. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Joanne. So let me see. So we still have quite a bit of time. The next person is me. So I'm the next presenter. And this is very interesting because we are 4 women from very different parts of, very different backgrounds. So we have someone in education, someone in human rights. We have Joanne, who's a psychologist that works for the government. And then I worked for the School of Business. So, but in the end, we have very common views for what I see. So let me tell you a little bit about my background. And then I will tell you what I have prepared for today. So I am a professor here at the University of Dayton. I am an associate professor of finance. And I started working here in the year 2013. I came from Michigan. And before coming to UD, in addition to being at Michigan Tech, I also taught in University of Missouri, Columbia, where I was a PhD student. And before my PhD, I was an instructor of economics at the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. ever since I've been in academia, I have spent a lot of time doing research, and I have published in several journals like the Journal of Financial Economics, Financial Analyst Journal, Journal of Empirical Finance, the Financial Review. I've been very blessed to have received several awards for my work. So I got the 2009 Graham and Dodd Scroll Award by the CFI Institute. In 2017, I also received the Best Paper Award by the Eastern Finance Association. And at the moment, I'm working on several projects, but the one that I think ties the best with this session is the work on economic inequality in the United States. So I'm going to share a little bit about that work, but in light of the pandemic. So let me start with sharing my slides. Hold on. I think we are in the here. Okay. All right. So this will be my presentation. It's about pandemics and inequality. And actually, I put together an earlier version of this presentation for St. Vincent de Paul Society. It was back in October of 2020. And at that point, we were right in the middle of the pandemic. And now I had to update some of this information with basically the end of the pandemic, going through many different waves. And here's some information that I have for you. So first, an idea of where we are in the global pandemic. So far, according to this COVID tracker that I've been using since the start of the pandemic, there has been 427,286,662 confirmed cases of the coronavirus. And there has been 5.9 million confirmed deaths from the virus. This is at the worldwide global level. And if you look at the trajectory of the virus, you can see several waves. When it comes to number of cases, the most recent one we have gone through is by far the one that has the most cases around the world, but it has not been the most deadly. So if you look at the surges that we have had, the different waves around the world, you can count how many mounts. It's 6. And the most severe when it comes to deaths was at the end of 2020. That's when we had the most deaths per day. And then each wave has gotten a little less lethal, but more contagious until we got to the last one. Now for the United States, we have had, as of the February 22nd, 80.18 million confirmed cases of the coronavirus. And at that moment, we had 960,000 deaths. I think that, this was about a week ago. And at the moment, we're getting really close to the million casualties. If you look at the different surges in the United States and you count how many waves we have had 5 instead of 6. And the reason is because in the summer of 2021, we didn't really get the same surge that everyone else around the world did because we were blessed to have vaccines early. So that arrival of the vaccines early actually spared us from another surge that happened in other parts of the world that didn't have access to the pandemics at the same time that we did. So that's where we are when it comes to the development of the pandemic. Now, what has happened to the U.S. economy as a response to this global sanitary health emergency? Well, one of the things that are interesting about the pandemic is that it has worked kind of like a big magnifying glass, I would say. So things that existed already in society have become more obvious. We have been able to see things with a greater degree of accuracy because the circumstances have been more extreme. When it comes to the performance of the economy, the first 2 quarters of 2020 were very, very difficult And that's when the government started to take some really swift action to support the economy with very liberal fiscal policy, with stimulus money, with PPP loans to support businesses, with money for the local governments. And you can see that actually that's the reason why we have this like V-shaped behavior of the economic performance. This is different from what happened during the Great Depression back in the 1930s. So if you look at what happened in the Great Depression, the first quarters were just as bad as what we experienced with the start of the pandemic. But because the social safety net didn't exist at that time and there was no policies in place for the government to support the economy kept on deteriorating for 13 consecutive quarters. We didn't have that because of the action from the government and all the fiscal stimulus that was poured in. There's been a lot of liquidity that has been put in the economy to support it. So the US economy rebounded later in 2020. So really the low point of the pandemic was April of 2020. So a lot of the statistics and information that I bring to you today comes from that time because this was the low point. And ever since, the economy has recovered slowly. Granted, there are still areas that have not gotten back to normal, but there's some areas that have recovered. So just a couple of facts that have been important in 3 areas that I think are key. The small business revenue, the revenues for small businesses, about 80% of the businesses in the United States are very small, are single owner businesses. So a small business revenue really commands a lot of the US population, while not necessarily all the revenue. So for small businesses, back in April 2020, revenues have fallen by about 22% nationwide. This would include anybody that has a small restaurant, everybody that has a small coffee shop or a haircutting place or anything in the service industry, anyone that has a service-oriented business that they just handle by themselves. This is equivalent to $4.6 billion during that month alone. Revenues increased for 61% of the industries during the pandemic after the large sustained recovery since April 2020. So after the government started to inject liquidity into the economy, 61% of these businesses started to see recovery. When it comes to employment, employment at the beginning of the pandemic suffered tremendously. So between March and April of 2020, the number of prime age people unemployed or employed but not at work increased from 7.9 million to 19.6 million people. We went from having an unemployment rate in the country of less than 3% to having close to 20 people without jobs in a matter of a couple of months. So that was a huge shock to the economy and to households. And the employment started to rebound within a few months, but remained really high during 2020. And then as of now, early 2022, there's about 3 million fewer people employed than before the pandemic. And these are people that most of them have stopped looking for work. So, and we have now something that's called the Great Resignation. During this time of the pandemic, many people have decided that they want a different way of life. This has created a lot of profound reflections, and many, many people have resigned to their positions. So we have a lot of jobs that go unfulfilled, and that has created the ability of workers to negotiate better salaries and better working conditions. When it comes to personal savings, that's another big area where the pandemic has had an effect. There was a sharp increase in savings as a percentage of their disposable income at the start of the pandemic. So because we didn't really have anywhere to go, people started to save more of their money. If you think December of 2019, the savings rate was 7.2%. 7.2% of their salaries went to savings. That rose to a historic record of 33.7% in April of 2020. At this point in the pandemic, now in 2022, however, many of these excess savings are being depleted by the poorest households. So there was a huge increase in savings. A lot of these stimulus checks were put into savings accounts that were used to do prepayments, some of them to pay down debt. But a lot of these excess savings now are being used up. And they are creating an unprecedented number. But at the same time, many people that have jobs have been increasing their savings and contributions to their 401k plans. And actually there was a report I just saw from Vanguard that was talking about a record number of millionaires, people that have more than $1 million in their 401k plans. So we have this big diverge between those that saved and unfortunately have to use all their savings, and those that have been able to use those excess savings to put themselves in a better financial situation for their future. So, and it's very unequal. A couple of other areas, access to food. According to the charity Feeding America, the number of people that needed food assistance increased all the way to 60 million people in the year 2020, which is a record, up 50% from the previous year. So one of the things that happened over the past century was food security, was the ability for households to be able to afford food for every day. But food security became questionable or more fragile during the pandemic. And this was one big effect that we saw. When it came to rent, in 26 states, more than 1 in 5 households was behind on rent in July of 2020. Many households fell behind. This kind of ties in with what Joanne was telling us about the city of Dayton, where there was the moratorium for evictions. So people that were behind on the rent would not end up on the street, because this was such a widespread situation that happened to many, many people around the country. And then also with financial fragility. So financial fragility means that you're so fragile in your finances that any kind of adverse shock is going to send you into a downward spiral. For low-income families with children, we're most likely to experience an income shock. This effect was magnified by Black or Hispanic families with children, typically single households and dependent on the service sector. So in general, more people were saving money, but the poorest of the poor, the poorest households actually became more fragile. Before the pandemic, I knew of this statistic that about half of the households in the United States didn't have more than $400. They would not be able to sustain a $400 emergency because they didn't have that kind of money in their savings account. This number increased dramatically during the pandemic. So the number of fragile households actually rose, even though their savings rate became bigger. So what does this mean? What the pandemic has really taught us, or has made us more aware, is how unequal society really is, and how the pandemic has affected people in very unequal ways, highlighting the fact that society in the US is highly unequal. And this is not something that is from now. This is something that we have known for a while, and especially in the academic community in the area of economics. We have been well aware of the economic inequality existing in the United States and having dire economic and social consequences, but it's not something that was discussed at large in society. And actually, what I think has happened is that these ideas that have been floating around in the academic areas have become more mainstream, and we're all discussing them, which is very healthy, because it's what is going to help us get to some resettings of expectations and making profound changes that can help us overcome these situations. So Here's some of the ways that the pandemic has been so unequal. And this is mainly based on the year 2020, because as I said, the economy started to recover really in April of 2020. So the worst of the pandemic was felt in the first 2 to 3 quarters of the year 2020. The pandemic hit the poor especially hard. So there was a huge divide between how people were able to weather the pandemic and staying at home and work from home, and even hire a private tutor for your children, and what everybody else had to endure. So the poor felt the effects of the pandemic especially hard. Also, the pandemic hit the elderly especially hard. If you look at the deaths, most of the deaths will come from the population 65 and older. And from this group, the pandemic hit Blacks and Hispanics especially hard. The majority of the deaths that we observed were from the elderly, and within that group, who had the most effects were Blacks and Hispanics. So there was a lot of inequality in the way that the virus actually hit society, but this is because society is very unequal. When it comes to employment, as I said, we lost about 20 million jobs in the first 2 quarters of the pandemic. This was after 113 straight months of job growth. So ever since 2009, with the financial crisis, the US economy had been adding jobs steadily every quarter for 113 quarters straight. And the pandemic was able to wipe out all those job growths in just 1 quarter, in just 3 months. Non-farm employment fell by 20.5 million jobs in April of 2020, which was the worst of the pandemic. This impact was much greater for the service sector than the manufacturing and other areas, and was felt mostly by women, non-white workers, lower wage earners, and those without a college degree. So this was Betsy Stevenson's work. She's a professor at University of Michigan that actually measured who faced the most losses in their jobs, and as these groups. So not everyone felt their loss of jobs in the same ways. Now, the thing is, we know now that inequality exists, and that is important because we can see the effect that it has had during the pandemic. But in reality, this is not a new phenomenon for the United States, and it's something that has been discussed in academic circles for a really long time. One of the most highly cited articles in the American Economic Review dates to 1964. And it is about how to measure inequality. So this is not something that we just started thinking now. It's something that people started to think back in the 1960s and were already concerned with. But it has become more widespread and more obvious now because we have felt the effects of inequality when there is a crisis. So historically, why is it that we have known for a while that this is an issue? Over the past 50 years, inequality has become greater every passing year. If you look at the top 20% households when it comes to earnings, back in 1968, those 20% better, highest earning households took home 43% of all the earnings, of all the wages that were obtained in the US. All the income, actually, not just wages, but all, even non-wage income. But then when you come to the year 2018, which is before the pandemic, this is figures from the Pew Research Center that have been keeping these statistics for a really long time. That top 20% highest earners were actually taking home over half of all the income that was generated in the country, 52%. So every year, more and more of this total income is taken home by just 20% of households. Now, you might wonder, well, so what? Is this really important or not? Does it affect, who does it affect? If we're not saying that we're not making more, we're just saying that distribution is more unequal, right? Well, actually, it turns out that it does matter. And I'll explain why it matters. And it not only matters to the poor households, it matters to the rich households also. It matters to all of us, everyone. And this is why, not going even beyond what Satan explained about human rights, why inequality is actually an issue that we all should be concerned with, because it involves the wealth and the prosperity of the entire country. The wealth gap between America's richest and poorest families more than doubled between 1989 and 2016. So just consider this. In 1989, the richest 5% of families had 114 times as much wealth as families in the second quintile of the distribution. But later in the year 2016, the top 5% had 248 times as much wealth as the median. So the amount of wealth that the richest families were concentrating more than doubled. Okay, so there's a huge divide between those that are really at the top and everyone else, making the country more unequal every passing year. And then we would wonder, well, so what? I mean, is this good or bad? Well, one thing that we can do is we can compare the US versus other developed countries that could be, fair comparisons to the US. So if we compare the United States Gini coefficient, that is an index that will tell us how unequal the US economy really is relative to, it's a number that the highest you get, the most unequal. And it goes between 0 and 1. So imagine that 1 would imply one feudal lord having everything and no one else, and everyone else having nothing. And a Gini coefficient of 0 would mean everybody getting exactly the same. Both are utopical, right? But in that measurement, the US as of 2019 had a Gini coefficient of 0.434. If you compare this against other developed countries in the G7, the UK has a Gini coefficient of 0.392, Italy 0.373, Japan 0.363, Canada 0.352, Germany 0.351, France 0.326. So the US really starts to look more like an outlier when it comes to the group of their peers in the G7, right? If you think about the entire world, the Gini coefficient, this number, goes as low as 0.25 in some Eastern European countries that because of structural reasons, because they were part of communist regimes, were really, by force, they were forced to be all equal, as 0.25 in some of these Eastern European countries, and as high as 0.5 to 0.6 in some countries in Southern Africa. The most unequal country in the world at the moment is South Africa, according to the World Bank. So we know that the United States is really moving away from their peers in the developed world, and in some ways it starts to look more like a country that is very unequal, a country that is still in developing stages. But turns out that the United States is not all made the same, and actually inequality, if you break down inequality across communities in the United States, varies widely depending on where you are. This map, actually, I made it last year while I was on my sabbatical, and I learned how to make maps. And this is the Gini coefficient by zip code. using the 1990 census information. So it's a little old, the data, but in reality, the spatial geographic distribution of inequality in the US has not really changed much. What has changed is the trend. So what can you see in this map? A couple of things.
Hi, Maria.
Yes.
I will remind the moderator about time.
Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. Okay. Well, let me just be very, very fast.
Sorry for
I'm the
interrupting.
moderator and I'm abusing the time. Well, thanks for letting me know. Okay, so here's some things that are important about inequality in the United States. Is that the United States is a country made out of many communities that are vastly different in the level of inequality, and we have some things that are structural that we cannot change. For example, cities are always going to be more unequal than the country, and the coasts, because they bring so many immigrants, are always going to be more unequal than the middle. And this is something that's probably not going to change because of the nature of the economy. But what we're seeing is that even the more equal communities are becoming more unequal. And that's what is disconcerting. I'm going to skip this, but here we have some of the rankings of the counties with more or less inequality in 2019. And all maybe we can take away is that the most unequal county in 2019 in the United States had a Gini coefficient of 0.59. That's New York County, New York, which is similar to what you see in South Africa, the most unequal country in the world. But then you have a county like Kendall County, Illinois, with a Gini coefficient of 0.329 that is more like France. So there's huge disparities in the levels of inequality in the United States. Why is this important and why is this a problem? A couple of reasons. The reason why we should care about inequality, in addition that it's social justice issues, is that it's a problem that affects all of society, including the rich, everyone, for a couple of reasons. First, because it limits education opportunities for children from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. This lowers social mobility, the ability to move across the social ranges, and hampers skills development. This makes our labor force less competitive against other countries, the other countries that we are in the peer group. Depresses economic growth because of lower aggregate demand. And when we have lower demand for products, then there are lower wages, lower aggregate demand, and then our market becomes smaller, so it's harder for us to compete. Turns out that in 2019, actually, the European Union surpassed the United States as a larger consumer market than the US, which is something that I didn't know, but it's a true fact. And also, inequality has been tied with research to many behaviors, such as criminal behavior, and also health outcomes and mental health outcomes. And this has a very high social cost. So the high cost of dealing with the social outcomes, negative outcomes of inequality, limits resources to other endeavors such as health, education, infrastructure, research and development, and that makes us less able to continue growing our economic systems and compete at the global stage. Let me see if I can, so we know that inequality made the crisis worse. The inability of some groups to be able to just maintain stay homes, keep social distance, and be able to get access to preventive measures of health made it so that the pandemic was felt much harder in some groups of society than others. And that's entirely tied to economic inequality, income inequality. If you have to work and you have to get out of the house, so you are able to earn a wage so you can feed your family that has multiple generations, it's going to be very difficult to fend yourself from COVID. So, some people, some households felt this virus much harder than others. mainly because of how unequal society is when it comes to the distribution of income. But the good news is that the pandemic can be seen as an opportunity to mitigate inequality. I'm not going to read the whole quote from Yuval Noah Harari, because actually what Satan wrote, the quote from Gutierrez, is very similar. But what he says basically is that there's really two main events in history that can be catalysts for big social progress. One of them is wars, and the other one is pandemics. So we could use this time as an opportunity to reset the economy. And I just have this slide with a couple of places where we could actually put efforts to use this, the pandemic and the lessons from the pandemic to make society better. The first one is when it comes to transportation. We know that so many people have had the experience of working from home for a while, that some of them have made permanent changes in their addresses and in their living and working arrangements, which are going to be permanent. And that reduces the demand for transportation, which could be huge savings for society when it comes to infrastructure. Without less people using the roads, we don't need as many roads. So that could be something that can help the local economies in particular that spend a huge portion of their budgets in fixing and caring for streets and roads. When it comes to education, we all have been, in this experiment of distance learning, forced, and that reduces the cost of higher education for immigrants, for first generation families, and also the opportunity to teach children and adults for a much lower cost. And then also when it comes to health, and this is actually something that Satan mentioned, the effect of COVID had been an opportunity to observe what happens when some groups of society do not have access to preventive health and good healthcare, because in the end it affects all of us. So this is a good opportunity to push for broad access to basic healthcare for everyone as a matter of public health and economic stability, rather than any other situation. So now we can say, look, this is how much it costs us as a society not to provide good healthcare for everyone. And if we are able to provide basic care, healthcare for everyone, this can have huge economic consequences, because people will not necessarily have to stay close to home because they are tied to a job that provides healthcare. They can increase their mobility, and that can add a lot of dynamism to the economy. So I guess I'm going to stop there because I know I went too far, but let's open the floor to questions. So let's see if there's any questions for our presenters.
Hi everybody, again, this is Corinne. And it's not a question so much as maybe a comment or a personal point of growth for me, having spent so much time in different countries in Africa, particularly in West Africa, that I have learned to reframe how I define poverty and how I speak about poverty, because, and so that there's a whole lot of growth there that I'm not going to go into, but I'm writing about. So based on those experience and growth, I speak your poverty, because our brothers, sisters, fathers, and sisters, and colleagues in Africa, as vast as it is, as different culturally as it is, they are so rich in so many ways that I will never ever be. And so I think it's important to understand the richness of that continent, like Dr. Amin said yesterday, and that yes, there is material poverty, but there is so much richness as well.
Okay. Very well taken. Thank you, Corinne. Any other questions or comments for any of the presenters?
If there's no question, I would just want to one or two things. I think one thing, I mean, just to piggyback on Corinne's point, I mean, I try to do that, especially in terms of how we see things and how we measure, poverty, how we measure wealth in my human rights and development class, especially around freezing and, the importance, and we were reading Stand the other day, but this is just an aside. But I think what I also wanted to spotlight, and perhaps it's not something I raised, was this idea around, especially given the vast experience of the African continent, especially in relation to specifically and other struggles, whether it has to do with the independence struggle, but also human rights struggles, as well as other struggles, right? The sort of the immense talent and expertise that we have, I think, especially given, as I said, the sort of regression or sort of the backlash in relation to democratic gains in the US, I think there is a lot of avenue for the US to draw from the global South based solutions. And global South based solutions, I'm not just talking about Africa, I'm talking about Latin America and other places that are considered global South, right? There is so much enormous expertise as well as creativity within these communities and societies that the US can learn from. And in a way, I think we're trying to do that with this symposium, but also within our specific, areas and work, especially in relation to being able to provide spaces where there is mutual dialogue between the North, across the North and the South, in terms of learning, in terms of sharing best practices. And I think we need to do more of this. This symposium is a great avenue for that, but I think there is room, especially in terms of learning what the experiences of the global South has been, especially with regard to human rights struggles, with regard to democratic struggles. I'm not saying we're there. Obviously, we're not. We're also still on the journey, but I think there is a lot of opportunity to learn from that as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you both, Corinne and Satang, because that's the reason why it's so rich and so useful to have a panel where you have multiple disciplines together, because we can certainly learn from each other. So in economics and business, we are having to learn so much from psychology and from sociology and from history, because we have been in our own silo and we're starting to look at the other areas. And that's where the true growth really comes, is when we're able to sit down and talk about different points of view and come up with a better understanding.
Maria, just to piggyback on my fellow presenters, I'm hoping that when we move beyond, we're post-pandemic, that we remember how interconnected and interdependent we are to each other, not only in the US and different communities here, but around the world. We're just one global community. And I think when we can move beyond the individual and think about the collective in terms of the humanity, I think that's when you're going to see our most growth as human beings, because COVID, good, bad, or indifferent, really highlighted the kind of inequalities, as well as the need to really show up other persons from not only in the US, but around the world.
That's very true. It's kind of like a highlight that made us notice things that were there, but sometimes we're just hidden, and now we're able to see them more clearly, right? Any other questions?
I was just going to put Dr. Amin on the spot.
Yeah. Any other questions for our presenters? Okay, well, Julius, would you like to finish the session with some words, and then we can...
This has been very exciting, and I want to thank all of you for the presentation. As you have stated, this is what the symposium is about, to engage in conversations, especially at this critical moment of our lives. The global pandemic has almost defined or changed the way we look at things. Institutions are changing. Just as Joanne said, that the city of Dayton is revisiting certain structures, certain things that exist. And Maria Shatan and Corinne, all of you have stated how different countries again, revisiting certain issues, how the pandemic has exposed the magnitude of inequality that exists in our world, even though we often like to celebrate the modern world as the best of times, right? Suddenly we are put in a situation to engage in a critical examinations of our community, of the societies in which we live. We hope that these conversations will go on. We hope that people will gain out of this the ability to, again, as I said, to think differently and to be part of this conversation. This is not a conversation that said, okay, it doesn't concern me, it concerns just people. Because as I've often stated, that those things, those problems you think are just taking place over there, eventually come to your doorstep. Always remember about the chickens coming home to roost, right? If you think that something is just over there, soon it'll be in your backyard. So again, I want to thank you very much, and please, to our participants, there's a session coming up in an hour, 3 o'clock. There's another session coming up at 7 p.m. Please, let's continue this conversation, and let us give a round of applause to all our presenters and to all our participants. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks everyone for a great session. Sorry about the rocky start, but I'm glad we were able to be here. And you have our emails, and we hope to go to those libations with you.
Thank you.
Definitely, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a
Okay.
great rest of the
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.